So to start us off, what I have is an open directory on my desktop named CRUD app. I want to add 2 folders within it. The first will be backend. This will store our backend code. The next will be front end, which will store our React application. Both of these folders should be within the root of our project. Next, we're ready to go ahead and install our Express server. So I'm going to type Control J to give me the shortcut to the terminal. I'll type npm init -y. This is going to generate a package.json that we see within the terminal. And if we go back to our project directory, we see that we have our package.json listed here. So within the terminal, npm I, and the first will be Express. This is going to give us a web framework so that we can establish our APIs. Next will be mongoose, which is going to help us interact with the mongodb database. And then we'll also have .env, which is going to give us access to environment variables throughout the project. Once we press enter, we'll give it a few moments to install those packages. So let's go ahead and start our Express server. Within the directory named backend, I'm going to add a file named server.js. In its current state, we can certainly go ahead and start the server right now as the project is, but I'd like to make one additional change, which is going to allow us to use the modern syntax as we are importing and bringing in different dependencies and files within the project. So back in the package.json, underneath the scripts object, I want to add a key name type, and we're going to set it equal to module. And basically what this is going to do is allow us to use the import syntax versus const when setting up our server. So if we go back to the server.js file, let's begin by typing in import express, and this is going to come from Express. We'll gain access to Express by creating a const name app, setting it equal to Express, and be sure to initiate it. Then we want our app to listen on port 5000, and if all goes well, we'll add a message to the console just stating that the server is going. Save this file, go back to the terminal to cd into the directory that has this particular file. So we'll say cd backend. To start the file, we'll just type node server.js. We currently get the message back from the console that the server is going. We could certainly continue to move forward with the current state of our project, but I want to make a couple more changes before we get going. We don't have the ability to get real-time feedback from the server. If we wanted to make changes and to confirm it's working, we'll have to stop and start the server each time. So let's go ahead and open up a new terminal. Within it, we'll type in npm I nodemon-d because this is going to be a dev dependency. Press enter. We see that the package installed successfully. If we go to our package.json, we'll notice that we have a dev dependency named nodemon. Now, in order to use this, there's a few approaches we could take. The approach that I would like to take is just by updating the scripts tag stating that we're going to be using nodemon. So let's remove the field test and replace it with dev, and the value associated with test, we can go ahead and remove it as well. We'll replace it with nodemon, and we want nodemon to point to the file server.js, so we know we'll have to go to the backend directory, and then we'll need to go to the file named server.js. If we save this file, we can close it out. Let's head back to the terminal. All we need to do in order to start our server is type in npm run dev because we want to run the dev script. If we press enter, we notice that we get a message back that the server is starting. Based on the console message that we have, we get a message back that the server is going. Now we're ready to set up our very first get route so that we have the ability to see something on our localhost 5000. So underneath the const app, let's type in app, and what we want this app to do is to set up a get request. The route will be the base or the root route, so we'll just include slash. The second part of the function will receive the request and the response. And what we want to send for right now is just a message to the browser saying that the server is going. So we'll type res.send and we'll just say server is going. Press save. Now let's go to our browser and go to localhost 5000. And as we go to our browser and it loads, you'll notice that we're getting the message back that the server is going. So great. So with this, we currently have our Express server set up. And ideally, what we'll like to display are subjects from the database to be displayed on the screen, but we currently don't have a database set up. So next, let's go ahead and set up a connection to MongoDB, so they'll do that next. So our database of choice will be MongoDB, and we'll be using the MongoDB Atlas. So if you go to mongodb.com, it's actually free to sign up if you don't already have an account. So take a few minutes to sign up. It's very simple if you don't already have an account. But if you do already have an account, let's just go ahead and sign in. Once you're logged in, if you already have an account and you already have a project set up, you're probably redirected to the latest project that you had set up overview window. But if you go to drop down next to the project name and you click on view all projects, it's going to redirect you to the projects window, and what we want to do is create a new project. Let's go ahead and name this project CRUD app. We'll just keep ourselves as the project owner, then click on create project. With the project set up, now we want to create a cluster, so we'll click create. We'll be using the free cluster for this project. Make sure that we're not loading any pre-sampled data, and we do want to automate security setup. You'll like to select the region that's closest to you to make sure that you're getting the best performance. Once you have all of these settings set up, go ahead and click on create deployment. Now we'll need to connect to the cluster, and we'll just go ahead and click on create database user. I'm going to keep the default password that's already listed. Then we'll need to select a connection method. We'll be using the driver's connection method. Next, if you're following along real time, you'll probably need to give it a few minutes in order for the connection string database to finish provisioning, so we'll give it a moment. So we want to go ahead and copy this connection string and store it within our environment variables. So let's go back to VS Code. So in the root directory of our project, let's go ahead and add a file named .env. Within this file, this is where we want to store our environment variables. So we're going to store the connection string to MongoDB in a variable named mongodb, mongo_uri, and we'll set it equal to the connection string that we just set up. Now I'm not going to show mine on screen, but make sure that you are updating this password with the password that was generated while setting up the connection string, or whatever you establish your password to be. Now we need to set up the connection function that's going to allow us to use the connection string and connect to MongoDB. So within the backend directory, let's add a folder named lib, and within that file, or within that directory, we'll add a file named db.js. So within this file, we want to establish the function that's going to connect to our MongoDB database, and it will be using the database connection string that we just stored within the environment variable. So we'll start by importing mongoose, and we'll create a export const name connect to DB, and of course this is going to be a asynchronous function. We'll start with a try catch block within this function, and we'll create a variable named con, which will use mongoose to connect to the database, and we'll be using the mongo_ui that we just stored within the environment variable, as that's the database that we want to, or connection cluster we want to connect to. If all goes well, we're going to log to the console that we are connected, and this is the name of our connection host. And within the catch portion, if we get an error, we want to be sure to log that error. We'll also pass in exit code 1, which is going to mean that we had a failure. Of course, 0 will mean that we had success. So let's just go ahead and save this file for right now and close it out. What we want to do now is test out this connection just to make sure that everything is working properly. So at the top of this file, let's go ahead and begin by importing .env, and this is going to come from .env. Then we also want to import the connection DB that we established, and this is going to come from ./lib/db, and be sure to include the .js or it won't work. So let's go ahead and gain access to the .env config. We'll be sure that we call it. And now, just to make sure that the connection to MongoDB is working properly, underneath the console.log, or within the app.listen right above the console.log, let's just go ahead and call the connection to the database. Now if we go back to our terminal by pressing Ctrl+J, and if we look at the console, we'll notice that the server is still going, but we also are connected to the MongoDB cluster, and this is the name of the cluster that we're connected to. So great. With that taken care of, the next thing we'll need to do is to establish the structure or the models that we want to have within our database. This is going to allow us to have the organization of our subjects, to make sure that we're passing in the right data, that we have access to pull that information and use it throughout the app. So we'll work on setting up our models next. Now we want to create our models that will allow us to store and interact with our database using Mongoose. So within the backend directory, let's add a folder named models, and inside of it, subject.model.js. This is the file that we're going to store our schema that will allow us to create a subject model. We'll start by bringing in mongoose. Then we'll create a const named subject schema, and we'll set it equal to new mongoose.schema. Within the object, we want to define the fields for our subject. We'll start with a name. We'll give it a type string. We'll set required to true. Then we want to have a color field. This will allow us to organize the subjects by color. We'll set the type to string. We'll set required to true. One additional thing I want to store is the timestamp. I'm going to set it to true so that we have the ability to see when we created and updated our subjects. With the schema built, we need to create a const named subject, and we'll set it equal to mongoose. We're going to use the .model method to create a model named subject. We're going to reference the subject schema. Then to gain access to it throughout the application, we'll create an export default named subject. So what we've done in this file is created a model named subject by using the mongoose schema. Now we're ready to move on to set up the API endpoints to interact with the database. Now we're ready to set up our API routes. We're going to go back to our server.js file, and we could list all of our routes within this one particular file, but I think because we eventually intend to grow our project, let's go ahead and make the code a little more modular by establishing a separate directory for our routes and a separate directory for our controllers. So within the root directory within the backend folder, let's add another directory named controller, and within backend let's also add another folder named routes. And what we'll do is we'll build our controller first, bring our controller into our route, and then our route into our server.js file. And this project, we're going to be using Thunder Client to test out our API connections. You're more than welcome to use Postman, Somni, or any of the other API testing tools, but I'm just going to use Thunder Client. It's an extension within VS Code, and just makes it a little simpler to test out our basic API CRUD routes. So first, let's go ahead and build out our controllers. So within the controller directory, let's add a file named subject-controller.js. Within this file, we're going to store our CRUD APIs that's going to help us interact with our database. We'll start by bringing in the subject model, and that is going to come from /subject.model, and be sure to include .js. Then we want to bring in mongoose. So the first function that we want to set up within our controller is the ability to create a subject. So we'll go create. And we'll go, so let's create a export const named create subject, and this will be an asynchronous function that will take in a request and response. Within the function, we'll need to set up a few things in order to create the subject. First thing we want is to create a const named subject that's going to capture this information from rec.body. Then we'll need to do some validation. We'll say if there is no subject.name, or if there is no subject.color, then we want to return a message to the user. So we'll say return, and we want to return a response with a status of 400. It needs to be in JSON, and we'll say that the success is false, and the message that we want to send to the user is please fill out all fields. And this is just giving us some validation to let the user know that if we don't get all fields, we won't be able to create a subject, and this will give us the opportunity to send that message to the user. Now if we do get the required fields, we want to create a const named new subject and set it equal to new subject. What we'll want to pass in is the subject from the rec.body. Within a try catch block, we'll say await new subject dot save. This method is coming from mongoose. We want to return a status, or set the status code to 200. Return a JSON message to the user with the success set to true. We'll set the data back to the browser. That way it could be displayed. So we'll return the new subject that we just created. Then the catch portion, in the event we get an error, we want to log the error. So we'll say console.error, and we'll say error creating subject. We'll go error.message. That way we can get that message. We'll also want to set the status to 500 and return a JSON back that the success was failed. So we'll say false. We'll return a message of create server error. So now let's go ahead and save this file. We'll need to gain access to this function. The way that we're going to gain access is by using it or incorporating it with the route. So in the root directory, let's click on the backend folder, and inside of routes, let's create a file named subject-route.js. So this file will store the routes of our application, and to get us started, we want to go ahead and import Express, and this is going to come from Express. Then we'll need to bring in the controller that we just created, and this is going to come from /subject-controller, and make sure you include the .js. And the function that we just created was create subject, and it imported without an error. Then we'll need to get access to the Express router, so we'll create a const named router, and we'll set it equal to express.router, and be sure to call it. And the first route that we just created was a create route, and anytime you are creating something, that is a post request that's being sent to the server. So we'll start with the create route. So we'll say router.post, and the endpoint for this is going to be the root route. We're going to have the ability to create subjects on the root route, and the function that we want to pass in is the create subject function. And then now to get access to it outside of this file, we want to say export default router, and we can go ahead and save this file. Now in order to use it, we'll need to incorporate it within our server.js. So we can go ahead and click on it now. So underneath the connection, so at the top of the file, let's go ahead and start by getting access to the subject route, and we'll say import subject route. We'll set it equal to and we'll say from./route. Now we'll need to bring in a couple of things in order to get access to this information. The first thing I want to do is incorporate some middleware, and this is basically going to allow us to pass JSON data from the server. So we'll say app.use, and we want to use express.json, and be sure to call it. We'll also need to give our app access to our routes that we just created. So we'll add a comment here for routes. We'll say app.use. The route that we want and the function that we want to give access to is the subject routes. Second argument that we want to pass in to our app.use is the subject routes. So let's go ahead and save this file and be sure that our server is still running. So we'll hit Control J to bring up the terminal, and you can see it is still running. Now we're ready to test out our route to see if it's working. And to test out our routes, we're going to be using Thunder Client. So I'll go ahead and bring it up now. And if you don't already have it installed, you can just install the extension. It's lightweight. It only takes a couple seconds. Otherwise, feel free to use Insomnia or Postman or any of the other API test tools. So in Thunder Client, if you click on New Request, what we want to do is first change the request from get to post. Then we're going to remove the current URL that's listed there and replace it with http:/localhost:5000. And because we did not add any additional, because we set everything to the home route, we're just going to leave our post request to just / and then blank. And what we'll be passing in, we want to click on the body, and we'll be passing in JSON data. So if you click on the JSON content and add an object, First field that we need is name, and we're going to name the first subject JavaScript. And then the second field that we have to pass in is color. And I'm just going to make up a color, but we're going to populate. Once we add in a front end, we'll populate colors dynamically. But for right now, I'm just going to add in a color just to have something. So I'm going to pass in the name and color as JSON with key and value. Click save just so that I save this information. And if we set everything up properly, we should get a status of 200 that we've just added our first subject to the database. So I'm going to go ahead and click send now. And as you can see, we got a status code of 200. It came back as a success, which is true. And we now have new data populated within our database. So let's go ahead and check out MongoDB just to confirm that it did store within the database. So if you refresh the screen and on database, click on browse collections, you'll notice that we now have the subjects table, and you should see that we now have one subject populated within the database. So great, we know that the create route ability is now working. Now let's work on the next API functionality that we want to set up, which is the ability to read or to get all subjects from the database. So I'm going to start within the controller. We'll scroll down the screen. Now that we have the create set up, let's go ahead and add in the get. So we'll say get all subjects, and we'll create a export const name get subjects. We'll set it equal to async, and we'll pass in a request and the response. And within the function, we'll start with a try catch block, and we'll create a const name subjects, and we'll set it equal to await subject, which is getting access to the subject model. And we'll use the mongoose method of .find, and within .find we're going to pass in a empty bracket, which is going to store all of the data or objects coming back from the MongoDB database. And then underneath the const subject, let's give it a status of 200, and we want to return a little bit of JSON. We'll say success is equal to true. And we'll set the data is going to be subjects, because that is the name of the variable that we just created. Within the catch portion, we'll say console.error getting subjects, and then we'll pass in the error.message. We'll set the status to 500. We'll send a little bit of JSON back to the browser. We'll say success is equal to false, and then we'll want the message to be error getting subject. Let's hit save. Now we'll need to pass this controller into the route. So we'll go back to the subject-route.js, and this is going to be a get route. So at the top where we have the import for create subject, let's add a comma and include get subjects, and it should automatically generate. And then this will be our get route. So we'll say get subject route, and then underneath it we'll type router.get, and we want this to be on the root route as well, so we'll just include the slash. The only difference between this and post is that the post or create route, is using the post method, and the get route is going to be using the get method. And the function that we want to pass back to this route is get subjects that we just imported. Now let's save this file. And we don't need to do anything within the server.js. We can actually just go back to Thunder Client, and I'm going to create or click on new request, and we'll leave the post request in its separate field, and we'll create a new field for the get request. So here we'll keep get set as is, and we'll replace this URL with http://localhost 5000. And we're just looking to get information back from the server. So all we need to do now is click send, and if everything goes well, we should get a status code of 200. And as you can see, we did, and it is showing the one route, or the one subject that is currently in the database. So let's go ahead and add one more subject just to be sure that it gets both subjects and not just the one. So I'll go back to post, and for the name, I'm going to remove script and just have Java. And for the color, instead of it being 222, I'm just going to go 999. Hit save. and click send, and we notice that we now have a new subject created with the status set to true. If we go back to MongoDB and refresh the database, we see that we have 2 documents within MongoDB. Now we'll go to Thunder Client to our GET request and click on send, and we notice that we're now getting 2 subjects back. So great, the GET request is working now. Now let's work on the U of CRUD, which is update. So we'll go back to our controller, and underneath the GET function we'll just say update subject. And for this one, we'll just go ahead and follow the same format as previously. We'll say export const, update subject is equal to async, and it's going to pass in a request and response. And within the function, we'll need to capture the ID, and this is going to come from rec.params. Did I spell that right? Yep. And then we'll create a const named subject and set it equal to rec.body. And we'll say if there's no mongoose.types.object.id is valid, and we'll pass in the ID. We just want to return a status of 404 and give a JSON message back saying that success is false and the message is invalid subject ID. Now this is just giving us some validation to make sure that we actually are getting good data before we send something to the server. This is just saying that if we don't get a mongoose object ID, if we can't find one, then we'll just return to the browser that that's an invalid subject ID. If we can locate a object ID based on the ID that we're getting, then we want to have a try catch block, and we'll say updated subject is equal to await, and then we want to access the subject model, and we'll say dot find, and this is a method that is coming from Mongoose. We're going to pass in the ID, we'll pass the subject that we're getting from the body, and then we'll set the method of new to true. Then we'll return, then we'll need to set the status, which this meant that prior line meant that we were able to access the subject and make changes to the body, and we're going to store it as a new document. So we'll say res.status is equal to 200, and we'll say then we'll need to return some JSON back to the browser. We'll set success to true, and we'll say the data that we need to pass in is updated subject, and we'll go console.error. We'll say updating subject error, and then we'll go error.message. That way we can actually see the message or to see the error if we were to get one. And now we want to set the status to 500, and we'll need to return some JSON back to the browser. So we'll say success is false. Then we'll say the message is server. I will click save. And now we'll need to create a route that can access this controller. So we'll say update route. And in order to update a route, we're going to use the put method. So we'll go router.put. And this will have a unique route that we need to dynamically pass in information. So in order to do so with Express, we just need to use the colon and then ID. And then the function that we need to pass in, we'll need to import it from the controller. So we'll go update subject, and that is what is coming from the subject-controller.js. And now let's pass this function into the put route. So now anytime we go to /ID, we'll have access to this particular function. And if we go back to Thunder Client, we can test it out. So we'll go to Thunder Client, and let's click on the get request first, and we can copy the ID from one of the subjects that we accessed during the get request. So I'm just going to highlight it and copy it. Now if we click on new request, let's change the drop down to put. We can remove the HTTP that is currently there, and we'll replace it with the localhost /5000. And then now let's just paste in the ID that we just accessed or that we just copied from the get request. And in the body, what we want to do is basically just send in new information or the information that we'll like to be updated for this particular subject. So I'm going to pass in the name, and I think this one was, I can't remember what it was set at, but I'm just going to change it to Python for the name. And then for the color, I'm just going to set it to pound 555. Click save. And then now I'm going to send this request and see what we get. Notice that we get a success message of true. The status is set to 200. And if we look in our database, we should see that the document with this ID now has a name of Python and a color of pound 555. So let's check it out. So going back to our MongoDB database, if we click on subjects, the document that ends in B3B now has a name of Python and a color of pound 555. So that works perfectly. Great. Now the last API request that we need to create is the delete request. So let's go back to our controller and we'll create delete subject controller. And we're going to follow the same format. We'll go export const delete subject and set it equal to async request and a response. And we'll start with, just as we did for the update, we'll need to capture the ID. This is how we're going to uniquely identify each subject. And this is going to come from rec.params. And then we'll copy, we can actually copy the same validation that we had within the update because we're going to need it for the delete as well. And instead of saying invalid subject ID, well, we can actually keep that. And then underneath that if statement, let's add a try catch block. And we're going to say await subject. And that is coming from the model that we created. We're going to say subject.find by ID and delete. And we need to pass in the ID that we are destructuring from the params. And then we'll say res.status is set to 200. And we'll send back JSON message to the user. We'll set success to true. And we'll give a message of subject deleted. And then inside of the catch portion, we actually can copy the same console.error and res.status and place it within the catch portion because it is going to be the exact same. And we'll click save. Now we'll need to get access to this controller within the route. We'll need to assign it to a route. So we'll go to the subject-route.js and we'll click, or we'll create a comment that says delete subject route. And we can say router.delete. And the route for this is going to be the exact same as the update route. So we'll go /:ID. And we want to pass in the function from the controller. So the name of it was delete subject. And we'll go ahead and pass in this function within this route so we have access to it. Now let's just click save and test it out. So we can actually go to the get request and let's copy the ID of the second subject that we created. And if we click on new request, let's change the drop down to delete and we'll remove the current URL, replace it with our localhost 5000 and just go ahead and paste in the ID that we just copied. And if we click on send, we notice that we got a status code of 200 with success of true and a message of subject deleted. Now let's go to our MongoDB database to check it out to make sure that it was actually deleted. You notice that we now have one subject within the database and it is no longer the one named Java that we currently had. It has now been deleted. So great job. We have successfully created a CRUD REST API using Mongoose to interact with the MongoDB database and an Express server. Next up, we're going to connect this to a front end using React.